greetings to everybody. Thanks so much to all of you for being here, for the panelists for joining us, I'm very excited to be trying to get a handle on the medical side of what's happening with the COVID crisis. Joining us that are really all experts and deeply involved in what's going on to remediate and address and manage the crisis we're in the midst of. So I'll just introduce them briefly in the order I'm going to ask them to speak, which I told those of you who were on earlier about whether I meant to or not. We'll start with Jess Mega, who's the Chief Medical Officer at Verily Life Sciences, which, as most of you know, is part of Alphabet/Google companies. Verily's been in the news a lot. They've got a big project underway, working especially with Rite Aid, but other partners as well, which Jess will tell us about. But I also she's a medical doctor, and I really want her to give us a big picture view of, based on her deep involvement, where we stand with the medical response to COVID. Then I'm going to ask Jim Weiss, who is the CEO of W2O Group, and someone who's been working in the pharma communications sector forever and really probably knows more people and more things about the pharmaceutical industry than anybody that I've ever met, to give us a big picture view of what's happening with the pharmaceutical response, drug situation, ranging from testing, antibody testing, various types of vaccines, etc. And finally, Paul Meyer, who I've known for many, many years, and I'm so pleased to have with us, has really already was in the process of developing a platform that turns out to be super relevant to the moment we're in, especially for helping employers understand whether their employees are healthy or not without violating the safety and security and privacy of the employee. So I think you'll all be very fascinated to learn what he's up to. Let me just start, Jess, as I said, Josh has got those poll answers up there. Is that everybody seeing that? So everybody wants to get tested. People aren't very confident that the medical infrastructure necessary to reopen the economy will be in place. And the tech giants, that's good for Jess, I guess, and public partnerships are the way, and consortiums are how we will get contact tracing. The vaccine, 18 months, that sounds optimistic to me, but let's hear what others say. Jess, give us the big picture view as a doctor, as somebody who is the Chief Medical Officer of Verily, so deeply involved with the response. Where do we stand medically, and how are we going to be doing on this?
So thanks for inviting me to be here. I think it goes without saying that this is a pandemic that has taken the medical community coming together, learning from prior pandemics, but again, this has continued to elude us in certain ways. The epidemiology, for example, continues to evolve. Originally, we were looking at more localized phenomenon as we watched our colleagues in Asia get affected and going through Europe, now in the United States. Certainly thousands of people affected, both the morbidity and mortality is something that we're tackling. I think one thing on the medical community side is we continue to learn and evolve how we're treating this particular pandemic. We'll talk about the idea of new vaccines and new therapies, but there's also even the supportive care. What we're learning on the medical side is the best way, for example, to ventilate patients who have the most severe forms of COVID-19. We've also been seeing thrombotic complications, so changes in the coagulation or in the blood system, and we're really trying to get ahead of that. Originally, that wasn't as front and center as we were taking care of patients. One thing that became really important for us about now 8 weeks ago, as we watched in the United States, public health officials, both local, state, and federal, try to figure out how to understand the epidemiology, was this idea of smart testing. Because at the time, there really wasn't an infinite number of supplies. And unless you can test, you won't really understand the underlying disease burden. Because nowadays, again, in the spirit of evolving epidemiology, some patients are asymptomatic. So the symptoms that we used to think would be telltale signs are now evolving, things like changes in smell and taste. And so when we were asked to say, is there any way we could get involved, as you said, in this network of public and private partnerships, we absolutely raised our hand. Verily is a life science and healthcare company that lives within the Alphabet family, and we've been working for years on platforms and technology that allows us to work directly with patients, order a test, get them securely to a test site, and have that information come back to them and to public health officials in a safe and secure manner. So our Project Baseline platform was something that we were able to stand up in a matter of days, not months, because we had been working on it. And over time, as you mentioned, we've now extended this smart testing, again, this idea of matching the right test to the right person, way beyond California, now in partnership with Rite Aid, testing tens of thousands of individuals. And I agree very much with the comment that it's going to take an entire community to get ahead of this particular pandemic.
Just quickly before we move on, how did you answer, or how would you answer the question we ask everyone? Will the infrastructure be in place, which is the multifaceted infrastructure, of course, by late summer to really allow the economy to start moving back towards some degree of normal functioning, which you're deeply involved in that part of the building of the infrastructure. So what's your overall view on that?
Yeah, so this idea that originally there was testing and there was limited testing, it's a fascinating study in supply chain. So you need the swabs, you need the media, you need the tests, you need the turnaround time. Originally, there were a handful of tests focused mostly on PCR. You're now seeing an evolution of antibody testing and this concept of contact tracing. So it doesn't matter that it's just, for example, me who might be tested, but if I test positive, how do you quickly contact people who I might have infected? We've seen this in epidemics before, but you're seeing an evolution, something that even a few weeks ago, we really didn't have the infrastructure. You're starting to see this evolve. I will say, though, nonetheless, as we continue to see the therapies try to evolve, whether it's monoclonal antibodies, whether it's vaccines, you're still going to start to see waves. And I think the best epidemiologists are projecting months of waves of this particular virus.
Okay, just one last thing before we move on. Obviously, the general consensus, I think, probably of everyone on this call is that there isn't enough testing for having the disease right now. You're deeply involved in trying to platformize that whole process. Is it your feeling also that we are still radically short of the amount of testing we should be able to be doing?
So it depends if you're a cup half full or half empty. You're seeing big changes in terms of test availability, in the sense that originally it was very restrictive in terms of, for example, our partnership with the California Department of Public Health. Really, the idea there was to test people who had either had a known positive contact or someone who had certain comorbidities that put them at the highest risk. As this program and others across the nation have evolved, you're seeing the categories start to expand. For example, frontline workers, healthcare workers, people who work in the prison systems now having more access to testing. And in fact, now there's at a point where people who, if they feel that they need to be tested, even if they're asymptomatic, those criteria have opened up. With that being said, the projection is that we need to be testing millions of people, and we're certainly not there yet.
Okay, thanks so much. We'll come back on to many of those points. Jim, so based on your decades, I don't know how many, but quite a few, in the pharma industry.
1992.
That's a long time.
Actually, it's earlier. It's further back.
Okay, well
Let's
tell us,
just start
what's your
there.
feeling? Give us your big picture view of how we're responding so far and what we have to do to respond.
Well, I think, we're responding as fast as, we can as an industry. It's interesting to go from being the industry that was a bit on its, hind legs, getting hammered for some, pricing practices, all sorts of other issues, and now being in a slightly different position to go faster and to go harder. And that's exactly what you're seeing. The industry, I think, has responded, as I'm not surprised at all. The industry is run essentially by researchers and MDs, and, their job is first to do no harm, and they've all taken the Hippocratic Oath. You've seen, initiatives where doctors from these companies are going back into the field to treat patients, in fact, so they're not just going back into the lab. You're seeing third-party groups like the one I'm involved with, the Cancer Research Institute, turn all of the labs that they're funding into COVID labs, because immunotherapy actually, immunology is actually a common science to this, disease. And you're going to see lots of drugs that might have been previously, being used or tested in cancer or inflammatory diseases now being, tested out in COVID-19. I mean, you already heard about, several. And, probably the biggest one that everyone's sort of waiting with bated breath are the vaccines, because if you can prevent it, that, of course, is interesting. Gilead's Remdesivir is the one that's the most, the furthest along. It's an antiviral that is.
That's a treatment, not a vaccine, though, right?
That's a treatment, and it's being tested in later stage patients. Of course, there's a lot of, discussion. Can you go sooner? Can you treat sooner? That would be, interesting. Can you treat with, an inhaled version? I mean, they're looking at other ways to give it. You saw the CEO recently on Face the Nation talking about that. There's a few other companies working on other versions and types. And, I think by the late summer, early fall, you're going to see numbers of, trials increasing. And I will say, the FDA, the NIH, other international organizations have responded as quickly as they can. And any time I've ever seen, they've run. Now, of course, there's a bit of an effect here. It's like everyone's running so fast. There's a little bit of a chase the tail, chaos going on that is somewhat understandable in a crisis. So, I think it's starting to settle down, and you're seeing a little bit more order come to it. The White House task force is winding down, and I think the scientists can, now take back over. Let's not leave this to politicians and government to run science and clinical trials. That's not what they do. I think
So you would see the task force winding down being a good thing.
Yeah, I do. I actually think it's
not
better,
that it's clear whether it's actually winding
well,
down.
Look, I wrote
maybe you know more than we do, but
well, I think
like
you got to think global, but ultimately act local. The state, it's clear the governors, and a lot of the states have, and even the municipalities have this in relative control. I would trust that they know their local areas best, and I tend to feel like leaving it to them to get it done with some support from that centralized government is fine. Let's use the NIH and the CDC the way it can be best used. So when I first came to Genentech in 1992, we were working on this thing called an HIV vaccine. That's what was going on then. We didn't have that nailed. We didn't know much about it, to the degree that, of course, now it's a treatable disease with a triplet therapy. So do I think we're going to get this nailed? Yes, we are. Will it take some time? Now, I mentioned the vaccine, and there is one that now is entering phase 2, soon to enter phase 3. It's moving very quickly, and it remains to be seen, how much protection that, first one will give, but there's several right behind it. And I think you might see something, most doctors are agreeing. You see Mark McClellan and Scott Gottlieb, a lot of ex-FDA guys and a lot of infectious disease experts think by the end of the year we'll have something that will give at least, short-term protection that can ring fence, an outbreak for a short period of time. And then I think it's going to take a longer time to get us a vaccine that will protect a global, much more global population. It's going to take a long time to manufacture that.
So the thing that's available end of year maybe would go to medical personnel predominantly because of the amount that would be available, for example.
Yeah, protect them first so they can treat everybody else. Because as Jess just said, we're going to see waves of this more than likely. And don't forget, we've got flu season coming. So everyone go get your flu shot, because we know that works. And I'm sure that'll be challenged in terms of, the supply, but you might as well get that one covered, right? So
how long before anybody can go to, CVS or Rite Aid, get a shot and be vaccinated?
Well, I think that's probably more like, 18 months, 12, I mean, 12 would be the very earliest you'd ever see that, but I think that's more 18 months.
18 months is okay. So that sounds optimistic to me,
18
but
months to
good.
2 years, that would make, but by that time we should have one or two of the antivirals should be, proven and working, and maybe, coming into an earlier stage situation, and the public will be better educated, as Jess said, and Paul will talk about, we'll understand how to assess our risk, and we'll be smarter about, okay, we know high blood pressure is not the best thing to have going into this. So, hey, maybe we got to lose weight. I've lost 30 pounds on this thing. It's like, great diet plan. We can go out and do things that might be better for us health-wise, because underlying health conditions are definitely one of the risk factors that we're seeing now. Can you do that in every population across the world? Probably not, but where we can educate people, that's of course what we tend to do in our business, which is to educate people online and through the COVID project, which I'm actually involved in, the COVID Check project. Information, knowledge is power. If we can get people to use, pulse oximeters, if they can get them, you can monitor yourself. I got this thing called an O-ring. It monitors my, my temperature all day long, actually.
What company makes that, Jim?
I've gone a little crazy. O-ring, it's actually something UCSF is doing a study right now on.
Okay.
They've just put them back out in the market. I mean, I'm not promoting it. I'm not involved in it, other than I just bought one because I've kind of lost my mind here a little bit. But
no, well, you've lost weight, which is great too, and not going to restaurants. That's caused a lot of my health to improve. I have to say, not to mention all the money I've saved. So there's some positives there. And I should mention, before we move to Paul, Jim and W2O Group helped us enormously in putting this session together. So thank you so much for that. Paul, so what is the problem you're working on, and why is it so important? And just give us the big picture. Oh, I think you're muted.
How was that? Is that better?
There you go.
Can you hear me now? Great, super. Well, I was thinking about, you and I met, I think, probably 15 years ago. When I was running around the world building public health, like disease surveillance systems in developing countries, right? And I grew up in public health, and I think we're at this really interesting moment, right? Public health has unfortunately always been this sort of neglected stepchild, right? And all the money and all the attention goes into healthcare, and we sort of neglect public health. All of a sudden now, as a society, public health is front and center. But it also means, I think, a lot of the models we've developed traditionally, certainly in the sort of healthcare world, have been sort of healthcare solutions, not this sort of public health model. And I think we're at a moment where, we do need to be thinking like public health people, because we're all in this together. And there are traditional models where people are building their sort of stovepipe solutions just for them, just for their employees, just for their members, just for their patients. Like, that doesn't really work. That doesn't meet the needs of the moment. And so as you and I have discussed, I sold my company, 2 years ago after many, many years. And I had a chance to step back and think about, what I'd learned and so forth, and really just came to the conclusion that technology is this incredibly transformative force in society, but almost entirely being brought in the world through venture-funded startups and big tech companies. And there are some services that are basically just sort of public goods. And we as a society don't really have a very good model for sort of financing, building, and operating them. And so we launched the Commons Project 18 months ago or so, launched out of the Rockefeller Foundation to really be a nonprofit public trust structure to build digital public goods, and spent most of the last year and a half building Common Health, which I think we can sort of is basically the Android equivalent to Apple Health, the version of the tool for individuals to aggregate their health information onto their Android phones and then share it. It really is sort of a personal health record. It's sort of an updated version of what Microsoft launched with Health Vault and Google Health did, 12 years ago, way before their time. And so we'd spent, most of the last 18 months building that. And then, a few months ago with the advent of COVID, given that, my background in disease surveillance, and Brad Perkins, one of our chief medical officer who spent 20 years at CDC, we sort of said, hey, what can we do around Sorry, a little interruption there. What can we do to help here? So we basically stood up and launched a service called COVID Check, and with great help from Jim and his colleagues W2O. So basically, it's an interactive risk assessment tool for people to understand their risk and check in and get support. Sorry, little slight distraction here. And again, but it's operated as a free public service, universally available. So unfortunately, Zoom School just let out for recess, and we're suffering from that. So basically, that's what we sort of launched. What we've been doing, though, again, is we've taken very much of a public health approach to it, and have offered it as a free public service. What we're now doing is we're starting to basically offer it to employers. Like every employer now basically is having to work like a public health person, right? And because not only are they worried about employee health, they're worried about how to bring their people back, but needs a picture of what's going on, need to understand whether their employees are doing well, who's sick, who can come into work, and so forth. And so that's what we have been working on. And we've also then started to bring these services together. So COVID Check, our kind of a back to work solution that we actually first developed with Georgia Tech, who have been working on how do they start to bring both their faculty, staff, and then students back to campus safely. We started working and developing this with Georgia Tech, and we've now turned it into something more generalizable for employers to be able to bring their employees back. But we're also have started, and this will get us back to where we started around testing. Right now, people are looking at things like, do our employees have symptoms? What's going on? Talk, please. But what we're starting, if we actually start to think about, given what's going on with scaling up of testing, people are going to want to not just be able to report on their own symptoms, but also potentially be able to ingest data from labs. And so we're working with both the big lab companies like LabCorp, but also some of the new emergent lab testing capabilities are being stood up to basically ensure that as those testing capabilities are being stood up, those data can actually be gathered by people and shared to inform some of these services. And so we're working to really promulgate open standards and APIs so that data that are generated by these lab tests can be basically aggregated and inform these kinds of services.
So to summarize, you're basically making an infrastructure that allows people to share the data about their own health status regarding COVID with their employers without sacrificing their privacy and without but yet still enabling the employer to really have some confidence that they're allowing people to work who are safe to allow to work, which is a pretty big problem. And thank you for working on that. And just quickly, I know you've always thought of the Commons Project and the platforms you're building as kind of like the Android version of Apple Health. And I know you're working with Apple on this as well, if I'm not mistaken. Can you just quickly talk about that aspect of it?
Yeah, so really it is an app that you can download on your Android device and then use it to basically connect into your electronic health record system, pull in data from smart devices, and basically take custody of your own health data. But do it in a privacy preserving way, which is really fundamental as you just described, right? So I as a person can aggregate my information, store it, I'm the only one with access to it, and then I can decide whether I want to share it. So if I want to share it with a new doctor, if I want to share it with a telemedicine provider, I can basically make that decision to do it. It's very relevant, though, to the employer use case, which is the reality is employers want to know that their employees are doing okay, but they don't, employers don't want to be accessing their employees' health records. And so we've architected this model so that people can store their data, their sensitive health data. It can be used to inform the picture that employers are getting about how their whole population is doing without the employers having to actually get that data, which they don't want, and people don't want to have to hand over their, right. I think we probably all saw that, news report a couple of weeks ago of Emirates Airlines saying they're going to blood test people to get on a plane. I mean, that's crazy. Like, airlines shouldn't get people's blood, nor should employers, but employers do need a picture to sort of figure out, hey, how are my people doing? Is it safe to bring people back? And if I see that some people at one facility or location, need attention, maybe we can escalate and take action.
Paul, will your system both incorporate testing about whether or not you have COVID, whether or not you've been tested, also the antibody testing? Is it intended to include both?
Yeah, ultimately, our system is just a tool to basically aggregate and report, right? I mean, there are right now, there's antibody testing, there's all sorts of new kinds of tests coming. Eventually, we're going to have vaccinations, hopefully before soon, and those are just new data points that ultimately can be ingested into this platform, right? So it's not sort of any one kind of testing or another. It's designed to be able to enable anyone to aggregate data about various kinds of testing. And again, part of what we're really advocating and evangelizing for, and again, the big labs do this, but a lot of the like home testing, we want to be sure that these new testing capabilities are being stood up, they're basically enabling the data generated by those lab results to be able to be accessible by people, but also to be able to inform public health reporting. I mean, it's been really challenging for public health to get insight into what's going on. And so, again, it's one of our messages to all the people that are setting up testing is ensure that you're using basically kind of interoperable data standards so that people can get access to their lab results, because people need those, but also that they can actually inform public health reporting, which is not traditionally been
And
very
just
easy
quick
with lab testing.
One quick last thing. I mean, because there's a lot of aspects to it, but you're seeing a lot of interest from employers, I presume. Can you talk at all about the level of interest you're seeing?
Yeah, it's been pretty overwhelming. I mean, we've been working with a lot of health plans who we were working with Common Health, and they're all seeing interest for their own employees, but also all of their employer customers. I'll also say that because we're operating a global platform, we're seeing a special interest for employers with employees around the world. And especially, by the way, those that have employees, for example, in Asia, because they've been dealing with they're just a few months ahead of us in the US on this curve. So the employees, companies in Asia have been doing things like daily check-ins for their employees for months now. And it's pretty
And I'm sure in China, those are required and there's no privacy, but go on. Yeah.
Absolutely. And so in some ways, though, but there's a real, so we've sort of looked at that model and said, hey, how do we do that here, but do it in a privacy preserving way? So it's really the ones that have been dealing with this for a long time, who in other geographies who have realized the importance of kind of getting a real-time snapshot into how are all my people doing today, so I can know where to intervene. And again, let's go back to where I started, which is every chief human resources officer, in the country now is kind of having to become a public health person in some respects and figure out how to kind of keep tabs and sort of respond to outbreaks within their population in the same way CDC is trying to do for the whole country.
That's challenging.
Or we need to hire one.
I just saw a quick question coming up in the chat, which we'll get to some of those questions in a minute, but somebody was asking about the funding model. You're a nonprofit. Rockefeller Foundation's given you a lot of support, but you're also getting support from a huge number of parties at the moment, including a lot of companies. So I know that there's a big momentum around this because there's such a need for a sort of neutral repository that is trusted by both the health record side where the data resides and the individuals whose privacy is of so great concern to them and the employers. So if I'm summarizing correctly, I hope I'm right. But I wanted to go back to Jess because, one of the biggest things, forgive me to take advantage of the fact you are a doctor here, and I know you're so informed, the antibodies question. What is your current thinking about what antibodies mean? Is there a way to summarize a response to that question?
Sure. So the traditional testing has actually looked at what we call PCR, so looking at pieces of the virus. When people are infected with the virus, they mount an antibody response, and there are a number of different kinds of antibodies. You might hear about IgA or IgM. The longer-term antibody, which we call IgG, comes several weeks after the infection. And that is how your body actually fights the infection. People are interested in measuring that because, at least with prior viruses, when people have had an immune response, they've been able to no longer be infected. So you may have heard of the term herd immunity. One interesting thing with this virus is that we are still figuring out as a community the best tests to use. And so you're going to see many tests that went through. They went through relatively quickly with the FDA. Now people are looking for more data. The second piece is we're still
and Verily is working very much on trying to figure out what the best tests are to use. Am I right?
Well, we feel an obligation to try to help understand this, and we're doing this. There are groups, for example, at Stanford and UCSF, and groups internationally. We've talked a lot about the international community, but unless we understand how to best measure this, then to your very early question, how do we open up society? How do we open up the world? Unless we can measure something, it's very hard to make informed decisions. So that is something. The other thing that's very interesting, and people believe, but if you have high levels of IgG, are you actually protected? So you're hearing a lot about that. There are new tests. People are talking about antigen tests, CRISPR tests. So diagnostics are, I would say, front and center, married only then with therapeutics and the vaccine.
So, do you believe that herd immunity will exist at some point? Is that a given in your mind?
Well, it's really an interesting trade-off, right? By sheltering in place, you actually limit the degree of exposure and the rapidity with which you get to herd immunity. People believe that's still the right thing to do, especially because of the side effects of this particular virus. So it will take us time to get there. You know, I do believe that it's a moment for the best testing, the best evidence. One thing that we have noticed, we've partnered with the FDA and the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Network, which is government-sponsored, to test even basic things like hydroxychloroquine. So we saw a huge flurry several weeks ago with hydroxychloroquine. We're working on a project to see whether it actually is helpful for healthcare workers that are really at the front lines. But what I would say is it's a moment to get the best evidence to make sure we know actually how to measure and then how to treat this particular illness. So again, I think you heard from Jim earlier, clinical trials, evidence generation could never be more important. And that's, I think, something as a community we're focusing on.
You're cautious about generalizing, which I understand and I appreciate. Jim, one of the things that's interesting having Paul and Jess here is they both represent tech platforms that are being brought to bear in creative new ways at a critical moment when we've got this vast society-wide health crisis. When you look at the role of tech and platforms in particular, do you think there's a sort of a sea change happening in terms of how we look at the need for such platforms? Because in my head, there is a sea change underway.
Yeah, I mean, it's overdue. I mean, I've been pressing on it. I helped launch, the first cancer immunotherapy vaccine way back when. Now it's old hat, of course, but, try to get people excited about that when it first came out. Genomic Health, when they first came out, now part of Exact Sciences. You would have thought you were introducing, actually Ebola into the universe, because people just were not going to give, new doctors were not going to switch over to genomic testing. And
you're talking about basic new trends in healthcare, right?
The new trends, the new ideas. Now, I was one of the first to sign up for, One Medical. I love the idea of, hey, I don't understand. I mean, my kids wouldn't even think twice about doing everything on this. I can't watch a show on this, but you can see that the screensaver is one my daughter put on long ago. I mean, I haven't changed that. And, the point is that everything will be Amazoned, Uberized, and Appified. We're all going in that direction. The fact that some of us just haven't gotten there yet, is beside the point. But where Jess works and, what Paul is doing is absolutely where it's going. And, the rest will catch up. It's just, this has accelerated everything.
Right.
Even if you look economically, the things that are closing, the things that are shutting down, that was all going to happen. We weren't gonna, gyms and some of these things were going away. Peloton was going to happen. Those things were all on their way to happening anyway. And, now this is all accelerated. So same thing here, with the world, who wants to get in the traffic jams that we were getting in anyway?
Yeah.
We wanted to crush, we had too many people on the subways and public transportation anyway, where you're going to get this disease, this pandemic, like they're not going to want to go on. So there's a lot of things that, this is just the natural order of things. The world kind of works this way. Of course, my kids think, this is all very Darwinian, and it's interesting to hear teenagers talk about it who've been, robbed of their senior year and feel the environment's coming back because of all of this. So it's really very interesting to listen to it. But again, science, medicine, that we had actually abandoned antiviral and antibacterial research. Now we're back in it, because of this. And, I think we'll see, I've done a lot of talks about it. And then the other very, very interesting thing is this individualized? Is there a genomic, proclivity? Is there some genetics or genomics that make you more susceptible to this? We are seeing very different reactions to this virus depending on, certain characteristics. Some people don't have symptoms. Some people are ravaged by it. Why? So we're going to have to do a lot of work in the ensuing months. First it's treat the crisis, but then we've got a lot of science to do therapeutically, to figure it out epidemiologically. There's a lot to work out over the next several months and years.
Thanks. Well, I know as a tech person who's been observing this, it's gratifying to me if there's something happening, regardless of how it is horrible, we don't like this, but if something is finally giving a societal push towards commonly shared tech platforms at the back end of medicine,
but tech and medicine
are
going to come together like never before. You and I have been talking about this at every South by, and now it's and Jess has been there, same thing, and she's at one of the vanguard companies, obviously that leading the way. So, here we go.
So I want to ask both Jess and Paul one question, sort of a basic one, and then I know we've got tons of questions from the audience. Are we going to get to a point in the relatively near future where all of us are being tested repeatedly and regularly, like I don't even know how regularly, but you can say, for whether or not we have COVID and antibodies, both? Is that basically the kind of world we're going into, where we're just going to have to constantly be tested, at least until a widespread vaccine is available? Jess, will you start with that?
So there are going to be certain people where that is absolutely true. You're starting to see that for healthcare workers, for example. The only way to start to get people to have what we typically call more elective procedures is to be testing people who are doing those procedures and testing patients. The other thing that's really important is we have to start opening up our medical services. People talk a lot about the implications of the virus. As you just heard, some people end up on a ventilator, some people seemingly asymptomatic. But there's going to be a second wave. There's going to be a second wave of people with cardiovascular disease, with diabetes, with mental health issues. And so there are going to be frontline workers and people where testing is going to be part of the daily routine. Now, I would say there are other places, and even if you look within a particular state, if you look within Pennsylvania, for example, if you're in big cities like Philadelphia, it's very different than if you're in rural Pennsylvania. So you're not going to see a one-size-fits-all solution. It's going to be based on the type of exposure and the work you do, as well as the demographics and the communities that you live in. This is going way beyond just viral epidemiology. This is talking about society. This is talking about politics. This is talking about the way we conduct our lives over the next few months to years.
Thanks. Paul, from what you're learning from the employer side, are they inclined to sort of start requiring testing all the time? Or what do you think about the basic question?
I think there's a wide variety, right? And as Jessica said, it depends on what kind of facilities, what kind of institution, what kind of staff. And so some very much so. And so some are taking a very kind of active approach to it, and some are, I think, are much sort of probably a bit more hands off. I mean, I think the reality is that we really don't know, and this is a very fluid and evolving situation, and it's going to change, and it's going to come and go, and it's going to be in waves, and it's going to be different segment by segment and sort of geography by geography. And so I think, the reality is that people are going to be implementing, it's going to be an evolving picture. And I think that's just the reality until we do get to sort of herd immunity, right? And that's, who knows when that is. And so I think that's when maybe I don't think anything will anything really gets back to normal. I do think, though, there are some really important decisions we face as a society. I mean, I think we've sort of, and one thing comes back to privacy, right? We've sort of, there's certainly been lots of articles that sort of just presume like, hey, we've got to give up privacy so that government can do contact tracing, as if we're being kind of forced into this, what I think of as a false choice, that like, oh, for the benefit of everybody, forget about privacy. It was, so 2019. I just don't, I think that's a false choice. And I think we need to be careful to sort of not, give up some of these foundational principles that, we, that are really fundamental. I think it's funny when changes happen in society, patterns get set. Like, here we are almost 20 years after 9/11 and we're still taking our shoes off at TSA. Like patterns get set and then they stick. And I think that it's really important as we're implementing some of these new models that we do them thoughtfully. We don't just sort of reactively kind of jump into something, because, the patterns that, and the models we adopt in this moment of crisis might be around for decades to come. And so I think it's really important that as we're thinking about these approaches, we stick to our principles and don't sort of get so caught up in the insanity of the moment that we end up implementing models that, we as a society are going to regret.
Thanks. Yeah, and thank you for working on what you're working on, both you and Jess. So Josh, I know we have a bunch of questions. Why don't you moderate a little of that?
Sure. Thanks, David. So I think, Paul, this one will sort of probably start with you expanding a little on your comment just now on privacy. Roger, you should be able to now unmute yourself if you'd like to ask your question.
Yeah, sure. So I remain skeptical about the privacy aspects of contact tracing apps. You have a location over time, which is tied to an identity, which is tied to a health record somehow. So how do you keep that data from being abused?
A great question. And first, but I think there's a big misnomer on what the popular press is called contact tracing, right? And obviously kind of Google and Apple have enabled the capability for people to kind of alert people that they might have been near. That for me is more contact notification than contact tracing. Contact tracing is sort of what shoe leather epidemiologists do, which is actually say, hey, I found someone that, is a positive case, now let me go. So I just think we actually, it's probably, too late to sort of change the way contact tracing has been sort of branded publicly. But contact tracing really is sort of public health investigation work. It's sort of case investigation and follow-up. That's what contact tracing actually is. And if you look at the way it's really, being done, for example, in California, it's being done the old-fashioned way. It's not being done with fancy new tech stuff. It's being done with like finding out, oh, we found these positive cases. Let me call them up, interview them. Where have you been? And so that's what contact tracing actually is. And that's the way, public health is doing it now. And that's the way it will continue to be done. And by the way, go back to some of the companies. I mean, there are companies that, we're talking to that kind of doing that themselves. And they literally almost have like little public health units within their organizations to say, oh, so-and-so got sick. Who are they working near on the factory floor? And so, yeah, that's sort of, that's what contact tracing is. I think there's real, potential on this sort of the Bluetooth stuff. And again, I think it's being, the way I have understood it being architected, and Jess may have more insight than this me, but basically the Bluetooth contact notification is really just a mechanism to be able to potentially send an alert to other people who also have enabled a Bluetooth-enabled app on their phones. I think the challenge becomes, and Singapore saw this, you have to get such broad adoption and opt-in for that to really work broadly. And I think, it's sort of 70 to 80% of everybody in a community needs to sort of have opted in to be able to, have enough of a critical mass to effectively notify all the other people that you've been near. So again, I think it requires a lot of opt-in that, I don't think we saw in Singapore. But again, just to be clear, I think that has been designed in a pretty privacy-preserving way. But, but I think it's not contact tracing. I think it's sort of contact notification.
Great. And so the next question, I think, I'm going to give it over to Reza in a second, but, he was really asking about the frequency of testing, which we already covered, but also the accuracy. So Reza, you should be able to unmute yourself now.
Thank you, Josh, and thanks everybody. Thanks, David, for doing this. My wife is a frontline provider, and as we speak right now, she's dealing with patients. In state of Maryland, I have personally worked with two medical systems in the state of Maryland on the tech and medicine side. The frequency, of course, we talked about it. That is important because it's not one time you test it and you're negative, you can go home and be happy with the rest of your life. But in terms of the accuracy, as we know, 15% false negative. It is not a good music to anybody's kind of mind that says that the percentage is coming in. And we have the mobile society. We cannot just protect one area in the rural area and then tell the New Yorkers, you can fly, you can travel to any place you wanted to go. So any comments in regards of the false negative and also being able to have the frequency of the tests in such a way that is more manageable in the ecosystem of our medicine? Thank you.
Thanks, Reza. Who wants to grab that one?
I'm happy
Rita,
to chime in.
Yeah, please. You are a doctor. You know a lot. Go ahead.
So what I would say, it's what your question really alludes to is the complexity and the dimension of time. So the PCR tests, in terms of sensitivity and specificity, those are the ones where people are using different swabs, and I'll get back to that in a minute. Those, again, sensitivity and specificity tend to be relatively high. People are confident with those. But you brought up two dynamics. One is that if you get a test on day 1, it doesn't mean that on day 3 or day 7 or 15 that you couldn't have somehow now gotten in contact with someone and had the virus. So there's the dimension of time, and that came out. Certainly frontline workers are going to need to be tested in a serial fashion. The other piece is, it's one thing to run the test, the technical mechanics. There's a lot of interest in how is the sample actually achieved. So the traditional ways, the long nasopharyngeal swabs, I'm sure people have heard a lot about those in the news. Now people are saying, could you do different kind of swabbing? Could you use saliva? So a lot of work going down that pathway, even at home testing. So there's news as recently as today. I do think we're going to have more and more progress. So the sensitivity and specificity is going to be there, but the repeat sampling is something that is going to have to be an area we pay attention to. On the antibody side, I mentioned earlier a number of different antibodies coming out. They're getting better and better. Those tend to be from a blood-based test. Again, a lot of progress on that front.
Okay, Josh, another one? Go ahead, Paul.
Actually, one thing I was sure, I think, this question gets to sort of one of these broader kind of more societal questions that I've been really kind of thinking a lot about, which is, when there's a lot of discussion around things like kind of immunity passporting, right? If someone is quote unquote, negative, what does that mean? And I think this is one of these questions that it is really potentially kind of fraught. And really important for us to be thoughtful about, right? Eventually, if you get a vaccination, you should be able to kind of feel comfortable going out in society. But given the lack of specificity, given the fact that, we don't really know, what are the consequences of basically getting, for example, an antibody test? And I think there's a certain mindset and assumption like, oh, we're going to, all of a sudden, people are going to get like immunity passports, which means they can now get on an airplane or go back to work. And I think this is a very complex and kind of dangerous sort of dialogue and a sort of set of assumptions that people are operating under. And I think we need to be very thoughtful about, what are the consequences if someone gets different kinds of testing, given there is still uncertainty about the validity, false positives, false negatives, and so forth. And again, so I think we should, certainly the way we've tried to think about it is, if you're able to, aggregate and have access to information, maybe it's today, it's an antibody test, eventually to be a vaccination record, but you want to inform people and let people make decisions. But where I get concerned, and you hear people talking about like, oh, we're going to require you to have done this, before you can come into my building or whatever. And I think that gets pretty scary, especially given the sort of some of the uncertainty around testing. So I just want to flag that, because I think this whole question about what are the implications for people based on what kind of testing they may or may not have is a really profound question that we need to get right as we, kind of
the idea of a multi-class society. The idea of a multi-class society scares me a little bit.
Very much so.
Discrimination based on experience.
But David, you and I have talked about this. We learned a lot in flu. Come on, like flu still sucks, right? And, for a lot of old people, getting flu kills them. And you got to wash your hands and you got to use certain hygiene. So a lot of this still applies. And I know this is big and scary right now because it's the first time we've seen it. So I know we're not supposed to equate the two, but the point is that even in flu, you guys, we don't have immunity from the flu. Right? We don't. And we're not going to, most folks don't believe we're going to have immunity from this other than you've got to go every year, every 2 years to get your booster. And I think that's the general thinking here. It's not like HIV or some of these other types of things that you've seen, at least so far. The thinking is it's going to be more like that. So the wash your hands, stand feet apart, probably shaking hands, we're not going to do it as much anymore. So the germaphobe mindset that we're learning right now in the shelter in place, the longer we do it, the more it will become habit, the less chance we're going to have to, what have we always said? Prevention is worth a pound of cure. That will save everybody a lot of money, time, effort. I mean, vaccines, treatments, they cost more money. It's more time, effort, energy. No one wants to get this thing because if you get it, you see you can, bust a hole in your lung and, who wants to live with that? So there's a lot of other complications. The point is there are some real important things that everybody must do all the time now. Wash those hands, stand apart, fist, do this kind of bumping. This thing about going into Mayo Clinic with no mask and walking around with no mask is not helping the situation. And I know there's some arguments about masks and touching masks and leaving them around because I've talked to a lot of infectious disease experts about that. But people have asked about planes. My in-laws were saying we're going to go on a cruise ship in September. I said, don't call us for help. I mean, I'm like, you have got to be kidding me. You're not getting on a cruise ship in September.
Are you going to get on a plane in 2020, Jim? Would you get on a plane?
No, I would not right now. Not because of the plane so much necessarily. It's just the airports and all the stuff you've got to go through.
Well, but this is the other thing, another divide that I'm really worried about. Once those of us on this conversation are probably still being very careful and conscientious and well informed.
Absolutely have to. Yeah.
But there's a lot of people out there who are not either well informed or conscientious. I mean, I'm in upstate New York right now. If you go to Walmart, there's a lot of people that don't even wear masks. This whole thing of people being shot because, they're telling someone you got to wear a mask to go into a store, which happened the other day. I guess the security guard was killed in Michigan. You saw the thing in Austin where the cop was pushed into the lake. I'm worried about some serious conflicts that are going to arise as we open up, but it's not maybe the purview of this discussion. So maybe we should go to Josh for the next question, we got time for probably two more.
Yeah, we're going to try to wrap at noon. We know everyone's on back-to-back. So let me quickly go over to a friend of ours, Ken Washington from Ford. Ken, you should be able to unmute yourself now.
And do identify yourself, Ken. I should have been asking the questioners before to do that too.
Okay, great. Thanks for this opportunity. I'm Ken Washington. I'm the Chief Technology Officer at Ford Motor Company. The question I actually have two questions. One is related to the time dimension that Jess mentioned. How confident should we be from an employer point of view if we implement testing and we have employees that pass an immunity test? How confident should we be that they wouldn't get reinfected as a result of a mutation in the virus? Or how long should we wait before we require that employee to be retested? And my second question is related to it, which is I'd love for you to comment on this herd immunity perspective, where some believe we should just allow all people to return to work and go back to somewhat of a new normal, except for those who are in the really high risk categories. That way we would accelerate the herd immunity. How strongly should we be debunking that movement, if at all?
I think Jim just commented on that with his tearing your lung out point, but Jess.
So starting with the second part first, I think there are times where herd immunity is perceived as something that could be done safely, and the downstream consequences wouldn't be so severe. I think the problem here is that we're still figuring out who actually goes on to have these very severe respiratory symptoms, cardiovascular symptoms. I mentioned at the beginning, even thrombotics, we're having clotting disorders in some people. There is interesting work being done on the immunology side, almost this immune fingerprint to see if it can tell you more. But because the side effect profile it can be fairly severe, this idea of just unleashing everyone really is not something that public health officials are saying is a good idea. Now, we have to be sensitive. There are workers where it is really important, critical workers, and we're going to have to figure out the right testing strategy. So that gets to the second point. I think you heard both Paul and Jim say that we're going to make progress with understanding the antibody testing, but whether that is going to be good enough for what period of time, and to actually, if the virus mutates, only time will tell.
I guess it's exactly noon. Josh, do you think we should ask another one, or maybe we should just give each of the three, if anything you wanted to say that you didn't get a chance to say in summary or whatever, please let us know, because this is such a multifaceted set of issues, and it's possible to touch on everything. Paul, you got any last thoughts?
No, I think just sort of at a high level that we're in this together, right? That we can't solve this problem by ourselves. No institution operates in a vacuum. And, I think the idea of being a part of sort of broader collaborative solutions, and frankly, kind of joining with public health, we've long neglected public health in this country and frankly around the world. And I think there's a chance as we're stepping up and putting resources to work to combat this emergency, that we can be thoughtful and do it in a way that actually bolsters our kind of collective health and bolsters public health. And I just encourage everyone, as you're thinking about how do we solve our problem, to do it in a way that's sort of collaborative and aligned with each other and with public health is just an important sort of mindset, because we can't just hunker down in our own, kind of self-isolated bunkers and solve these problems by ourselves.
Thanks. Any other final thoughts? Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Jess. Thank you, Paul.
It's great. And it's interdependent problem. It's time to step up, get involved, and don't expect anyone else to do anything. Don't assume anything is getting done. Jump in and really help out. That's what I found. People are a little bit paralyzed right now, and now's the time to go in and help untangle it and move it forward. So, and again, technology is absolutely, I think, helping that.
Thanks, Jim. So. And I know Jess said 1,000 Google employees from across the company volunteered spontaneously to help get their whole thing deployed. So there's a lot of that spirit at your place, Jess. Thank you. Any final thoughts?
And I would just say, I think that this is such a complex time. This is complex. Personally, it's complex for the society, is complex for economics, but there's never been a better time for partnerships and for compassion. And so if there's a silver lining here, I think it's the latter two.
Thank you so much. Thank you to all of you. We'll be revisiting this topic going forward. So